I want you to know that today is the first Sunday in Advent. Advent is the 4 Sundays before we celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem. And it is, as I shared at the beginning of the liturgical calendar of the year. What that means is that in our movement through the story of faith that we make every year, this, my friends, is the beginning. And so like every beginning, there is an invitation and an opportunity to do something different. We have not yet moved into the first part of the month of December, and so if the church liturgical calendar confuses you, I invite you to consider that we are at the beginning of December, and because it is the beginning, you and I have the opportunity to choose to do it differently. We are beginning this journey through Christmas, which we all know in this country begins like a mudslide with Thanksgiving and just swipes us away all the way until we're exhausted at the end of the year. Yes? And I want you to remember that this is the first Sunday in that mudslide, and therefore, because it is a beginning, you and I can choose to do something different. Now, what in the world am I talking about? I want you to consider how many times you have journeyed through this Advent or this Christmas season, if you ask the world, and how many times you've come to the end of it and felt more tired, more broke, and less present to the God who you are supposedly celebrating. Who's come to the end and felt like the journey did not get you to the destination? My invitation is that today we can make some choices about how we will do it differently. And as I was considering this, I began to think about all the ways that this season is God's word for us, God's hope for us, God's promise to be present. And yet, why is it in a time when we celebrate God becoming intentionally accessible in human form that most of us feel more stressed out, more isolated, and more alone? What are we doing as a church in the very moment that God is seeking to reveal God's self? Why is it that the time when the promises of hope, and I mean true hope, I don't mean plastic hope, I don't mean simple hope, I mean hope that comes out of the Jeremiah kind of struggle, when the promises of hope are being fulfilled before our very eyes, why do we often feel in despair? Like there's not a way out of the darkness we stand in. Why? In a season when we are invited to wait for the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem and wait for the second coming of Jesus, why do we rush so hard that we crowd out any possibility that God would speak to us? I started to do some research about this and found that there are so many ways in which our mental health experts speak about this season long before COVID even came to being. The American Psychological Association back in 2018 found that 38% of people say their stress level increases between Thanksgiving and New Year's. Are you in the 38? Right? And of those 38 whose stress level increases, only 8% of people say they're happier. 8%. Now, I understand that faith is way more than a feeling, and I understand that we are called to a journey together, but my question is, what is happening in our true selves compared to what we are speaking with our mouths as we worship? While Christmas is known to be a season for the jolly, it can be a significant source of stress and pressure and conflict for so many of us. As I was reading through article after article, one that was written all the way back in 2018 started to name some of the very specific ways in which this season co-opts our hearts and we go numb. Who's ever gone numb this season? Right? It actually makes me think, and I spent all Thanksgiving weekend thinking about this. This is a story that doesn't necessarily have an easy ending. So sometimes as folks come through the food distribution line, there's someone who will ask for the opportunity to speak to the pastor or pray. And so in this particular instance, somebody did. Their car was pulled to the side. I was asked to speak to them. And the question that I received was very specific and poignant. Pastor, do you know anywhere that I can get a hot Thanksgiving meal with other people on Thursday? The person said to me, now, don't take this the wrong way. I'm very grateful for the food that is being provided and for all of the ways that you've walked with us in this season. It's just that I live alone and I don't like to cook. And I just want to be with somebody on Thanksgiving. I thought about this all weekend. In fact, on Thursday in the afternoon, I called this person to see if maybe I could take them some of our own Thanksgiving dinner. I didn't get a call back until late last night, so the story doesn't have a fairy tale ending. But it spoke to me again of the fact that we live in the midst of a world in which people are very clear that all that has been promised has not been fulfilled. And that in many ways, the pressures of this season deepen our sense of need of God in the very moment that we get so stressed out. What do? We pull away from each other, from God, and from hope. In 2008, long ago, a mental health professional detailed some of the ways in which this season becomes particularly challenging. I've talked a little bit about stress caused by busyness and the pressures of shopping and time and financial and social demands, as well as fatigue. This article spoke also about family stress. And I don't mean that we don't love the people in our families even when they're challenging, but the truth is when we come back together, we are faced not only with our own journeys, but with others. And those journeys tend to be as bumpy and challenging as our own. And so we find ourselves in this mudslide from Thanksgiving into New Year's, struggling with not only what's happening within us, but all of the ways in which our family is journeying as well. Then there is the reality of mental health. I am telling you, if you believe anything that I say to you as your pastor, first of all, hear me when I say you are not alone in your anxiety and your struggle. The number of people who are raising a hand and reaching out is unprecedented, and our youth among them. And so if we already are standing in fragile mental health, the question is, we pack so many other expectations on top of it. And we wonder why the hole feels bigger and more empty. These can be seasons in which we feel lonely and isolated, particularly for older folks living alone. Many do not spend this season in the company of anyone, and many people who are single find themselves isolated in a way that in some regards COVID protected them from. Diet, how about that? When you eat all the sugar and you have a sugar crash, when there's no routine in your exercise or in what you eat, and everything gets thrown out of kilter, and it impacts how we are feeling emotionally and mentally. And finally, did you know that more than 80,000 people a year in 2008 need hospital treatment for Christmas-related injuries, such as falls and cuts and burns? And add to that excessive alcohol consumption, domestic violence. This is not an easy season. But we don't talk about that. We put on a pretty face or a handsome face and walk in and pretend like the season just overtakes us. Enter God through Jesus Christ, a God who decides, chooses to become flesh and live among us. A God who chooses to show up in the messy middle and walk with us until the final redemption. Sometimes I think we miss this fact that God doesn't just show up in the victory when it's all done. God walks with us through the challenge. So my question for you and for me this season is, who can we walk with and how can we walk with ourselves in the places that we truly need God with us? Because we don't love doing that, do we? We don't love showing up with all of the needs that we have, that God might simply be with us. Have you ever been in a season of waiting for your grief to get less, waiting for somebody to get better or eternally better, waiting for an answer from somebody that has been too long coming, waiting for somebody to forgive you or for God to move such that you could forgive them? Waiting for somebody to come home, waiting for a relationship. Raise your hand if you have waited. And in that waiting, has anybody ever just been with you? Has anybody ever just shown up and walked with you in the journey? Waited with you without trying to offer you a reason that you should hurry up and get over whatever you're experiencing. Somebody who's waited with you, who hasn't looked for a list of justifications of how you got yourself into this mess and how you might get yourself out. Somebody who's simply just been. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And God didn't fix every problem in the very moment that God showed up. God just was. Emmanuel, God with us. If we're too stressed and too fragile and too separate and too afraid, how can we possibly be present to ourselves, to each other, and to the God that is knocking on the door? What do our words speak? And what do our hearts really believe? I want to look for a second at the power in the John passage. I think we pass over this passage so often that we don't pay attention to what God is promising. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus the Christ is God, and Jesus the Christ has existed from the very beginning of time, and yet God, in God's infinite wisdom, knew that you and I needed an incarnate presence with us. So let's not miss the biggest gift we've been given, because we're rushing through a season that has very little to do with what God is speaking to our hearts. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him. The very places that are gaping and open, because you have them, right? The places within you that you come to worship, desiring that God would fill. Not only does God know them, but God has been with you from before they were formed within you. Because God is the one who redeems you, buys you back from the brokenness, brings you out of the darkness into the light. God is the God incarnate and among us that we need. Scripture tells us that what has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and what? And the darkness does not overcome it. That is more than a Christmas candle on December 24th. That is a promise that God is aware that there is challenge around you. God is aware that there is brokenness and need. God is aware that there is so much it feels like it would extinguish the one last light that exists, but the hope is this: there was light in the darkness, and the darkness does not, cannot, has not, will not overcome it, because Christ will come again. This is a real hope, folks. Not a fake hope, not a plastic hope, and not an easy hope. Then we meet this John the Baptist who comes to bear witness to the light. And I want you to hear in John the Baptist what you and I can be for ourselves, for each other, and for this world. There can be one that says, I know there is a God who hasn't left you, so I'll stand right here until you can see again. I know that there is a God that has purpose and power for your life, and so I will not leave you orphaned or alone. John was a witness to the light, and you and I are called to be witnesses to the light, but we have to get beyond the Christmas lights to find the light of the world before we have a message to share. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. This is the second thing I want you to consider. We think that strength, God's strength, our strength, somebody else's strength, is when we push aside our weakness and push on. God took human form in a baby. We'll baptize a baby in this service, indefenseless, unable to do anything for themselves except speak out. Sybil knows this. Speak to mama all the times that you have need. That's the way God showed up in God's strength. And so this season, when everything in you says, I don't have the strength, I invite you to consider God has already redefined what that strength looks like. An indefenseless child in a manger, because there was no room in the crowdedness of the rest of life. A woman who never believed herself to be possible to be chosen. And so in the places where you and I want to push through this season, declaring that we have it together, God invites us to demonstrate in our fragility and in our need, in our humanity, the strength that God gives us. We're using the Max Lucado study because of Bethlehem. I must confess to you that I really think the example he uses in the first chapter is problematic. He speaks about some white missionaries in Liberia, but his point there is that when this white missionary starts to cry, the folks of Liberia see a level of humanity that draws them deeper. So let's throw out the part that, in my opinion, is laced with racism, and let's pay attention to the fact that when you and I are transparent enough with each other in this season to acknowledge the challenges we walk through, God is present. And there is a different kind of hope and a different kind of power. The last thing I want to suggest is that the Luke passage gives us some very clear guidelines. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, don't be so burdened by this world that you miss it when I show up. Don't be so overwhelmed by the injustice around you that you actually miss the redemption that I'm pointing you to. Don't be so heavy laden that you miss the possibility that not only did I come, but I will come again. This season, Max Lucado finishes this first section by making a suggestion which I think is very valid. His suggestion is take inventory in your life of people you call friends and consider how you might show up to them as Jesus? Now, I'm going to extend it a little bit, but we'll start with Max. The people that you are close to, what might they need this season? I'm not talking about a gift. I don't want you to spend a dime. Might they need you to call them? Might they need just a hand on the shoulder in a moment? Might they need to know that you're hurting too? Might they need to know that you believe even though there's doubts sometimes? How would you show up to the people that you call friends? And then, how do we show up in the world? How do we show up as a witness to light in a time when it is most challenging, because the language of Christmas actually overwhelms the power of what God has done? So you and I are going to have to get real authentic and real transparent with ourselves so that we can show up as witnesses to the true light. I believe more than anything else that this season we have to do it different. Because if I always end up in January exhausted, I'm starting December tired. If it makes me more tired to get to January, I don't know, you're not going to have a pastor. We have to do this different. We are now at the point in which we need God in a way that I don't think we've known we did before. And my question is, it's just starting. How will we do it different? Who will you reach to? Who will you talk with? Who will you share a cup of hot chocolate with when before you would have blown by the appointment? Who will you let see your tears? And who will you let hear your hope that Christ will come again? We are beginning anew, and this is the time to make a different decision.
Jesus be the center of it all. Jesus be the center of it all. From beginning to the end, it will always be, it's always been you, Jesus. Jesus, everybody say Jesus at the center of it all. Jesus at the center of it all. From beginning to the end, it will always be, it's always